"Oh no, not the Walmart general again. Cringe alert!" The voice rang out over the loudspeaker, playful but cutting. Laughter cracked like a whip across the park. A ripple of amusement, uncertain at first, spread through the crowd. A few teens near the snow cone stand turned, phones already filming. One snorted. On the raised plywood stage beneath the bunting and flags, the young man with the microphone grinned wide at his camera. Phone held high, live chat rolling. His tank top bore his channel name in bright red lettering. His voice boomed again. "Don't salute too hard, Grandpa, as you might pull something." The camera panned to the side, to a thin, still figure just off the grass line. Francis Brenner, 83. Dressed plainly in a short-sleeve khaki shirt and a clean olive cap, faded ribbons pinned just over his heart. His right hand was raised in solemn salute. Slow, honest, steady despite the tremble at the fingertips. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't flinch, didn't move. But the fingers of his salute shifted just slightly, as if reconsidering whether to complete the motion. Somewhere behind him, a toddler's laugh turned into a long, uncertain stare. A woman frowned, pulling her child gently behind her. The anthem was still playing through rustling speakers, but now it felt thinner, off. On the far side of the grass, beside a row of empty chairs, a man in full dress blues slowly rose to his feet. He hadn't smiled. He hadn't moved. Until now. But the man in uniform wasn't laughing. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. Francis Brenner had never missed a 4th of July ceremony, not since he returned home from the war that didn't get parades. The war that ended on paper but lived on in bones and lungs and silences between fireworks. Every year, same spot, just west of the flagpole, where the sun didn't hit until midday and the slope gave a slight advantage to the weak-kneed. His old boots always found the worn patch of grass before the crowd came in. He never brought a chair. He stood, or knelt, or leaned if he had to, but never sat during the anthem. That was his rule, though no one ever asked it of him. He came alone, always, dressed simply. The khaki shirt ironed smooth, sleeves crisp to the elbow. The olive cap was washed but never replaced, its edge fraying, its insignia faint with age but clean. 2 pins, one from his battalion, the other gifted by a fallen friend's mother. Francis always arrived an hour early, not because he feared traffic, but because it gave him time to prepare, time to walk the grass, stretch the leg that never healed right, and position himself without drawing eyes. He carried a folded flag, not in a case, just wrapped in careful layers of cloth and memory. It wasn't decorative, it wasn't for show. It was his brother's, Jimmy's. That triangle of folded stars was the one thing that never left Francis's side on this day. But this year, something was off the moment he arrived. The park had changed. The stage was larger, more colorful. Banners for sponsors flapped lazily from the awning. The county had invited a local content creator to bring attention to the event. Boost engagement, they said. A few younger staffers had called him a great draw. Makes veteran stuff fun again. Francis didn't understand the appeal, but he didn't argue. He had no use for arguments anymore. His usual corner by the flagpole had been fenced in, turned into the main viewing section for the live stream. Cameras, ring lights, an inflatable red-white-blue arch that blocked half the view. Francis stood for a long moment at the edge of it, then adjusted, quietly, without complaint. He moved 20 feet east, behind the benches, next to the flower bed planted by the school kids. There he opened his worn satchel and took out the handkerchief, the one marked faintly with a faded laundry number, a ghost from some long-defunct army base laundromat. He cleaned his glasses with it, slow circular motions, then folded the cloth neatly and placed it back in the side pouch. Then he pulled out the small wooden case, lifted the lid just briefly, and looked once at the photograph inside. Not long, just enough. 2 men in uniform, soaked from the knees down, one with a hand over the other's shoulder. The photo had aged. The bond hadn't. He sealed the case again and tucked it beneath the flag. then straightened his back, adjusted his balance, and looked up toward the stage. It was louder this year, not in volume, but in presence. Voices without reverence. A buzz of commentary, cameras flicking. The influencer, a wiry man in his 20s with neon sunglasses and a wireless mic clipped to his collar, was testing sound levels by shouting trivia questions. His assistant was recording crowd reactions. The mayor, sheepish, hovered near the flag with a clipboard and a forced smile. Francis watched without judgment, but his fingers tightened slightly on the flag. "Sir, are you all right standing there?" a young volunteer asked. Her voice was kind, but distracted, eyes on her tablet. He nodded once. "Yes, thank you." She moved on, already halfway into her next duty. The anthem was 10 minutes away. Francis turned to face the flag, the real one, hoisted high above the crowd, gently curled in the light summer breeze. He raised his eyes to it and waited, just as he had in country, just as he did when only one man stood in formation. Behind him, the influencer's assistant grinned toward the camera and whispered loudly, "This guy's gonna break into taps next." Someone near the grill chuckled. Another voice said, "He does this every year. It's like a whole cosplay thing." Francis didn't react. His feet remained planted, his spine aligned. But his breath was slower now, more controlled, like a man bracing for something he couldn't quite name. Then the first note played, a wavering trumpet call from an old speaker. The anthem had begun, and Francis Brenner, 83, forgotten by many, remembered by few, brought his hand to his brow with the slow dignity of a soldier who'd never stopped serving. The crowd rustled, phones lifted, kids kept talking. But somewhere, at the very edge of the ceremony, a man in full dress blues had stopped watching the stage and started watching Francis. The anthem played on, distorted by the cheap park speakers, warbling slightly in the heat. The flag above shifted once, its edge catching the sun just as Francis Brenner's salute held firm. His hand, angled precisely, hovered with the steadiness of decades practiced. No bravado, no motion, just the stillness of a man who had learned long ago the difference between performance and principle. Behind him, the buzz never stopped. The influencer's assistant paced between camera tripods, whispering about engagement metrics. Two teenagers snickered as they recorded themselves pretending to march in formation, hamming up cartoonish salutes for their phones. The stage MC, waiting for his cue, tossed a water bottle into the air and caught it with a smirk, nodding to someone off camera. Francis lowered his hand slowly as the final note faded. He didn't blink, didn't look back.
He adjusted his glasses and turned slightly, just enough to reposition his stance closer to the edge of the grass. It was hotter now, the morning shade receding fast. The stone bench behind him was already half lit, but he didn't sit. As he moved, someone behind him laughed and muttered, "Look at this one. Takes 10 minutes to cross the lawn." Another voice, younger, more biting, added, "He's probably filming us and uploading it to the Veterans of Foreign Facebook group."
A few snorts followed, not loud, but enough. Francis continued without pause. His right foot dragged slightly. Old damage, nothing new. He made it to a shaded corner near the war memorial and settled there, not resting, just standing off to the side like a shadow that refused to disappear. A group of teens nearby burst into laughter. One of them pointed his phone at Francis. "Guys, hold up. We're gonna do Old Soldier Reacts to Fireworks. Ready?" He mimed tossing a firecracker, crouching low with a fake duck and cover. The others laughed again, filming without shame. A woman with a stroller nearby turned her head. She didn't speak, but her eyes narrowed. Her child watched quietly, holding a tiny paper flag. The influencer's assistant looked over at the commotion and rolled his eyes. Let him play. It's a free country, right? He waved his gimbal camera away and repositioned to catch more crowd shots. Francis didn't move. He simply reached for the folded flag, ran his thumb along one seam, and let his breath out, slow and silent. It had taken him years to control the tremble, not make it go away, just quiet it. Let it stay beneath the surface. That was enough. The mayor climbed the stage and tapped the microphone. And now, a few words of gratitude from someone who's keeping patriotism alive online. Please welcome our local favorite, Shane from Flagged Up Media. Applause. Thin, but present. The influencer jogged up with exaggerated energy, slapping the mic like a boxing ring announcer. "What's up, freedom lovers? How we feeling out here today?" He grinned into the crowd, turning to his live camera. "Welcome to the land of BBQ, bald eagles, and bad knees, y'all." A few laughs, a few claps, mostly confusion. He turned, gesturing wildly toward the crowd. "And look who we got in the background again. It's our favorite veteran cameo, back for his annual salute. Let's give it up for Captain Old School." Francis stood still. One of the teens near the side shouted, "He's doing it for TikTok." The group laughed. The camera panned. A few nearby adults turned, uncertain, eyes flicking between the stage and the old man at the memorial stone. The Marine in dress blues remained motionless behind the final row of folding chairs. He had not taken his seat again. His arms remained crossed, and his eyes had not moved from Francis once. Francis adjusted the flag in his hands. He looked down briefly, just enough to check its fold, then lifted his gaze again. He said nothing. Behind him, one of the teens called out, "What's he got in that bag? Must be his Purple Heart from the Battle of Facebook." Even the speaker paused for half a second, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But the laughter carried him forward. Still, no one stood for Francis. No one stepped in. No voice cut through the noise. Only the breeze moved, tugging gently at the hem of his shirt. And though he didn't turn, Francis knew he was being filmed. Again, the moment could have passed. If they had let it, if the comments had remained whispers, if the jokes had stayed in shadows. But disrespect, like wildfire, grows when it catches wind. And this morning, the breeze had picked up. Shane, the influencer, adjusted his mic, cocked his head toward the sound technician, and waited for the canned music to fade. Behind him, the chat on his stream bubbled with laughing emojis and fire icons. Some begged for more boomer content. Others urged him to go full savage. He read them as he spoke. "I mean, seriously, folks," he said, turning to face the edge of the grass. "This guy comes out every year like clockwork. Same shirt, same hat, same vibe. Dude's got more pins than followers." The crowd tittered, lightly, uncertainly. Francis didn't turn. He remained where he was, next to the plaque, the folded flag steady against his side. His shadow, cast long by the rising sun, stretched toward the stage, but he gave no attention to the noise above it. "Hey, Private Grandpa," Shane called, raising his hand in a cartoon salute. "At ease, soldier. I think we're safe from the Confederates today." That one got bigger laughs, more from discomfort than delight. A couple of parents frowned. One woman muttered something and pulled her child away toward the lemonade tent. Then Shane turned back to the camera. "Man, it's like this guy's auditioning for a war movie no one asked for." He laughed and gestured wide. "We love the enthusiasm, but let's be honest, the 4th is for fun, not funerals." Francis blinked once. Slowly, he shifted his weight slightly, as if adjusting his stance. His fingers, resting gently on the flag, twitched. Barely, but they twitched. And that's when Shane crossed the grass. It happened fast, no warning, no setup, just movement. He stepped down from the stage, holding the mic loosely in one hand and his phone in the other. He walked straight toward Francis, with the lazy confidence of someone used to attention, used to being unchallenged. A few people murmured. One staffer raised a hand half-heartedly, unsure of whether to intervene. "Sir," Shane said, voice theatrical and loud, "thank you for your service. And your content." He mock saluted again, this time inches from Francis's face. Francis didn't flinch, didn't speak. Shane leaned closer. "Try not to get PTSD on my live stream, okay, old-timer?" That's when it happened. The laughter exploded, like glass shattering on tile. Some in the crowd laughed outright. Others, nervously. A couple people clapped, not knowing what else to do. One teen repeated the joke out loud to someone behind him, and Francis lowered his salute, but not like before. This time his hand dropped with a tremble he could not control. His shoulders remained square, but his eyes, behind those thick, polished lenses, turned slightly, not toward Shane, but toward the ground. He did not speak. He did not move away. He just let the silence hang between them. Behind him, a man stepped forward, a local member of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, mid-60s, ball cap in hand, chest tight. He took 2 steps toward the confrontation, his face red, his jaw clenched. But before he could reach them, the assistant, still filming, blocked his path. "Back up, sir," the assistant warned, flashing a badge from the event's media sponsor. "We're rolling." The veteran stopped, confused, angry, but unsure of the line. Francis remained where he was, shoulders square, eyes forward. Then Shane turned back to the stage, laughing again. All right, I'll behave," he said into the mic. "We love our veterans. Round of applause for history class, everybody." Scattered claps, some embarrassed, some forced, a few heartless. And somewhere behind them all, the man in dress blues stepped into full view. He did not smile. He did not speak. But he was no longer in his chair. The laughter didn't follow him as he stepped away from the stage. It had already moved on, like a breeze that came, did its damage, and left without apology. Francis walked quietly across the lawn, cutting behind the second row of chairs where the shade still lingered against the concrete memorial wall. His footsteps made no sound. His shadow, now shorter than before, clung to him like an echo. The crowd didn't watch him leave. Not because they didn't see him, but because they chose not to. Some were still chuckling under their breath. Others looked down, fidgeting with programs or plastic water bottles. A father whispered something to his son about not getting involved in other people's business. The boy looked toward Francis but said nothing. The Marine had moved too, not quickly, but deliberately. He no longer stood at the back. Now, he lingered near the row of children seated with their school's civic club. His eyes never left Francis. His posture was relaxed, hands behind his back, shoulders square, but his presence carried weight. Enough that even the MC seemed to hesitate on his next line. Francis reached the edge of the stone, a small granite slab tucked beside a flower bed in bloom. It bore no spotlight, no ribbons, just names. 17, carved deep. Underneath, a simple bronze seal, to those who stood when others fell. He knelt, slowly. His right knee bent first, the one that always cracked, followed by the steady drop of his left. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't meant to be. One hand on the ground, the other clutching the folded flag against his chest. He eased into stillness like a man settling into prayer. The grass beneath him was warm. A beetle crawled beneath the edge of the plaque. Francis leaned forward and placed his palm flat across the names. His fingers trembled, but he stilled them. The granite was warm, kissed by hours of morning sun. He closed his eyes. Behind that closed gaze, time thinned. There was no stage now, no crowd, no microphones. There was only dust, jungle sweat, boots deep in the muck, a voice over the radio, clipped, urgent. Then another voice, younger, cracking through fear. "Brenner, I can't see. I can't see." He drew in a breath, let it out, then reached into his satchel and drew the weathered handkerchief. It was cream once, before decades dulled it into the shade of old parchment. It bore the faintest ink trace of his serial number, nearly invisible now, just a ghost of identity pressed into cloth. He unfolded it in 3 practiced moves, then cleaned his glasses with quiet precision. Circular strokes. One lens, then the other. It mirrored the motion of men who once cleaned rifles, not out of habit, but because survival demanded it. Once cleaned, he refolded the cloth and tucked it back into the leather edge of the bag. He placed his glasses on again and looked toward the flagpole. It snapped slightly in the breeze. The crowd behind him laughed again, this time at a joke unrelated to him. The moment had passed, for them. The influencer was making faces, taking selfies with veterans he deemed cool, and handing out branded sunglasses with little flags on the side. The mood had shifted, like sunlight pushing away morning fog. But none of it touched Francis now. Because Francis wasn't gone. He was present, entirely. Back straight, knees grounded. His presence was not a statement. It was a habit, a conviction, a way of surviving in a world that had long since stopped asking how he was. The Marine had moved again, closer now. His dress blues caught the sunlight in soft highlights. Polished buttons, creased pants, shoes shined to mirror. He carried no banner, no fanfare, just stillness. He moved through the crowd with a steadiness not unlike Francis's own, deliberate, respectful, unbending. He passed the stage without looking. He passed the mayor without a nod. He passed Shane, the influencer, who paused mid-joke to glance at him, briefly confused by the Marine's silent proximity. And still, the Marine didn't stop. He walked straight toward the memorial, toward the man kneeling in silence, toward the one presence in the park that had not demanded attention, but had earned it anyway. And with each step he took, the noise behind him began to thin, not because he asked, but because something in the air had changed. A subtle shift, a pause, the first tremor of awakening. He hadn't come to speak. Not this time, not officially. Master Sergeant Levi Cordell had been sitting near the back row since before the anthem started. Arms crossed, eyes forward, not listed on the event program, not introduced by the mayor, and not recognized by the local media crew milling around with stickers on their windbreakers. That's how he preferred it. When he came to 4th of July events now, it wasn't to be seen. It was to observe, to watch how remembrance was handled by those who had never worn the weight of it. But when the laughter hit the way it did, sharp, flippant, full of ignorance, Cordell felt it in his teeth. Not anger, not rage, just the deep, cold tightening in the gut that only came when something sacred had just been trampled without anyone noticing the footprints. He had clocked Francis Brenner the moment he arrived. It was the way he stood by the pole, like he had stood in too many formations to need instruction. The way his salute came not at the loudest part of the anthem, but at the exact note the flag caught full in the sun. It was the ritual of it. Not flashy, not posed, but precise. There were men who had served that Cordell barely remembered, and others he'd never met but would never forget. Francis belonged to the second kind. Now, watching from 30 yards out, he saw the veteran kneeling at the stone, back straight, flag tight against his ribs, head bowed. No ceremony, no fuss, just fidelity carved into posture. Cordell didn't rise immediately. He waited through the joke. The second one, then the third, the one about the live stream. That was when he stood. He didn't rush, didn't stomp, just straightened his frame and adjusted the brim of his cover. His shoes whispered over the grass. 1 or 2 people noticed the glint of his rank and stepped aside without thinking, not out of obligation, but something older. He moved past a small boy holding a pinwheel. The child's gaze lifted and tracked him instinctively. Cordell gave the slightest nod, and the boy's hand lowered. The pinwheel stopped spinning. No words were exchanged. The influencer's assistant noticed the movement and raised his phone again, sensing a moment, no idea what it was. His lens panned toward Cordell as if to ask, "Who's this?" But no answer came. Cordell walked past Shane on the stage without acknowledgement. The prankster paused mid-gesture, watching the Marine cross the grass without so much as a nod. The stage crew had gone still. The chatter began to fade. He reached the stone, stopped beside Francis, said nothing. He looked down at the plaque. His breath left him slowly, like a man exhaling through memory. Then he reached up, removed his cover, and held it by the brim with both hands. And in that single motion, that careful, deliberate act, the entire crowd shifted. Not physically, not yet, but something invisible snapped taut, like a cord pulled between silence and awareness. Cordell looked at the flag in Francis's arms, then the stone, then the names. He stepped one pace closer, then lifted his hand and saluted. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't long, but it was perfect. The fingers held straight, the angle precise, the intent unmistakable. No music played, no microphone fed his voice to the crowd. He didn't ask for attention. He simply gave it, fully, to the man who had never asked for it himself. Behind them, a woman with a stroller lowered her iced drink without realizing. A teenage boy shifted his weight awkwardly, pulling his phone down from eye level. One father, sitting with his daughter, removed his hat and placed it on his knee. No one had been told, but something had changed. And up on the stage, Shane finally lost his words. He opened his mouth to make another quip, but nothing came. The laughter had faded. The comments in his live stream began slowing. Someone typed, "What's happening?" Another, "Is this real?" The Marine didn't turn. Not yet. His salute remained held, unwavering. Francis didn't look up. Not yet. But the moment between them had become louder than any speaker in the park. The microphone in Shane's hand began to lower. Cordell's arm came down. He replaced his cover gently. And then, for the first time that morning, he turned to face the stage. Cordell didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need a spotlight. He didn't even need to say a word. Not at first. The quiet was louder than any declaration. He turned from the stone with the steadiness of someone who had spent a lifetime measuring his movements. Not for show, but for purpose. His boots whispered against the grass as he stepped from the memorial toward the edge of the stage. The crowd, once noisy and restless, had fallen into an uneasy hush. Conversations had withered, phones had lowered. Even the children sensed it, that this wasn't part of the performance. Shane blinked, twice. He held the microphone slightly raised, as if unsure whether to keep recording or offer it forward. For the first time all morning, his expression didn't read smugness or sarcasm, just confusion. He looked over at his assistant, who had stopped filming altogether. No cues came, just stillness. Cordell walked past the foot of the stage and paused. He looked not at the crowd, not at the mayor, not even at Shane. He looked back, once more, toward Francis, still kneeling, still silent, still anchored to something deeper than humiliation could reach. Cordell's voice came low, not forced, not strained, just firm. "On your feet." His words didn't echo. They didn't need to. The command sat in the air like smoke. He didn't shout. He didn't repeat it. But it landed like an order all the same. There was a beat of absolute stillness. Then another. A breeze stirred the corner of the flag where it rested in Francis's lap. A woman near the back shifted to rise, then paused, unsure, waiting for a sign. Cordell turned to the crowd slowly, his eyes sweeping over the faces. He wasn't looking for recognition. He wasn't scanning for agreement. He was offering the room a choice: rise or remain seated in the shadow of disrespect. And then he said it again, not louder, just clearer. Now. It wasn't barked. It wasn't theatrical. It was how real orders are given. The kind men don't question because they already know they're right. Shane took half a step back. The mic in his hand drooped. He looked around, waited for someone, anyone, to laugh, to ease the tension. But the crowd had gone still. Not uncomfortable, reverent. Like a room recognizing it had misread the moment entirely. The mayor stood, quietly, without fanfare. He adjusted his jacket, removed his hat, and placed it flat against his chest. Others followed. A woman with a service dog. A boy holding a miniature flag. The older gentleman who'd tried to intervene earlier. He stood slowly, hands clenched at his sides. Then came the sound, not of applause, not of cheers, but of metal chair legs scraping softly against grass as dozens, then hundreds, rose to their feet. One man whispered, "Who is he?" Another answered, "Doesn't matter." But it did matter, because something unspoken had been restored, not explained, not demanded. Restored. Cordell didn't address them. He didn't turn it into a speech. He simply held their eyes, one by one, until they stopped looking for someone else to lead. Then he turned to Francis and saluted again. This time, not for him, but with him. Francis looked up, slowly, through glasses now catching the rising light. Their eyes met across the grass, and for a breath, the two men stood alone in the center of the entire town. No camera clicked. No streamer spoke. Just two men, a Marine, a soldier, two generations that had known sacrifice the world had forgotten. And in that wordless second, a bond formed that didn't need explanation. Cordell dropped his salute, stepped toward the stage, and for the first time since the mockery began, Shane said nothing at all. Francis didn't rise, but something inside him did. He'd heard Cordell's voice as clearly as he once heard the call to fall in line at dawn. It wasn't just the volume of the order, it was its weight, the way it reached past the years and the noise and the bones that no longer obeyed like they used to. Cordell hadn't raised him from the ground. He had restored him, given back something the stage had tried to strip away. But still, Francis remained kneeling, not in weakness, but in choice. His own way of finishing what he'd started the moment the anthem began. Cordell stood alone at the foot of the stage, his back straight, shoulders squared, face unreadable. Not stern, not emotional, just grounded, like stone that had stood through 1,000 storms. He did not acknowledge the crowds rising. He didn't glance at the mayor or the organizers. He didn't offer them comfort. This wasn't about teaching a lesson. It was about something older than correction. Restoration. A wrong had been committed in broad daylight, and the only proper reply was silence filled with truth. Somewhere near the back, a teenage boy pulled off his baseball cap and looked around. No one had told him to, but he saw the way Cordell stood. He saw the way the air around Francis had shifted, how even the trees, it seemed, held still. The boy stepped closer to his mother and quietly offered her the cap, unsure what to do with it, but certain it no longer belonged on his head. She took it gently, her other hand dabbing her cheek with a balled-up napkin. Tears, not of sadness, but of something heavier, something long buried and suddenly unearthed. The veterans of the local post, seated quietly in the second row, had begun to stand one by one. They moved slowly, some using canes, some resting on arms, but none remained seated. They did not cheer. They did not chant. They did what they'd been trained to do when a man like Cordell gave that kind of signal. They responded, not as a protest, but as acknowledgement that Francis Brenner had stood alone long enough. Near the edge of the shade, the prankster's assistant lowered his phone without realizing it. His fingers had stopped recording minutes ago. The lens still pointed forward, but it captured no words now, just images. A kneeling veteran, a Marine standing like an obelisk in the sun, a town slowly remembering what respect looked like. For the first time since he started following Shane, the assistant said nothing. There was nothing to add. Cordell turned his head only slightly, just enough for the edge of his eye to catch Francis, still facing the stone. Their eyes met through the glass of Francis's cleaned lenses, and though neither man moved, something passed between them. No salute, no nod. Just a knowing, the kind that doesn't require confirmation. The kind that had crossed battlefields and decades to exist in this very moment, between one man who gave everything and another who never forgot. A few more townsfolk rose, the youth pastor, the librarian, a coach from the high school. They hadn't been involved in the earlier laughter, but they'd heard it. And now, in the quiet, they realized they'd heard something far more important. Silence, with purpose. From behind the small podium at the side of the stage, the mayor stepped back. He looked toward Cordell as if waiting for him to speak, but Cordell didn't move toward the microphone. Instead, he stepped back toward the stone. One step, then two. The crowd shifted with him. He didn't face them yet. Instead, he turned slightly toward Francis and reached into the inner fold of his coat. His motion was calm, deliberate. There was no dramatic pause, no cinematic swell. just a hand unfolding the edges of something laminated, soft, from where? "I carry a few of these," Cordell said, voice low, not projected. "Stories the world never honored properly." He unfolded the yellowed page slowly. The print faded, the edges frayed, and held it not toward the crowd, but toward the stone. "Francis Brenner has been in my wallet for 11 years. He didn't elaborate, didn't explain where he found the clipping or how he'd come across the name. He just let the words sit in the air, as if they were all the proof required that what was happening now had always been meant to happen. Francis turned his head slightly, and his eyes locked on the piece of paper, not with pride, not with confusion, but with the faintest glimmer of something that hadn't been there since he arrived. Recognition, not of himself, but of something bigger than self. Cordell stepped back, the crowd leaned forward, and for a moment, just one, no one breathed. Cordell didn't hold the newspaper clipping aloft like a trophy. He didn't flash it for the cameras or present it to the crowd as proof of righteousness. He held it gently, like one holds a folded flag, careful not to crease it further, as if the paper carried more than words, as if it held breath. The laminated surface caught a glint of light. A faint breeze tried to tug at the corner, but Cordell's fingers remained still. The image, though faded with age, was unmistakable. Two young men caked in mud, caught in mid-laughter beside a battered field tent. One had a bandaged arm slung across his chest. The other, barely out of his teens, was gripping the handle of a stretcher with blood on his sleeve and smoke curling behind him. Cordell's voice came low, even, not rehearsed, remembered. "This man," he said, nodding toward Francis, "carried two of my brothers out of Quezon. One of them had a collapsed lung. The other was bleeding out. They said he never looked back, not once." He looked toward the crowd, scanning their faces, not for recognition, but for readiness. Then, back down to the paper. His name was never printed in the papers. He didn't get a medal ceremony. He got a folded flag, a bus ride home, and a job sweeping floors at the old factory that doesn't even exist anymore. Cordell paused, not for effect, but because the next words required a different kind of strength. He lost part of his hearing that day. Shrapnel took it, didn't tell anyone, just kept showing up to work, same way he showed up here, every year, same flag, same stone. Francis remained kneeling, still facing the names, still silent, but his jaw had set in a way that wasn't resignation anymore. It was memory, old memory, not the kind with pain, but the kind that time wraps in quiet reverence. Cordell lifted the clipping just slightly. "Francis Brenner," he said again. "Bronze Star. No ceremony, no microphone. Just a man who served, came home, and kept his head down." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the kind of story they expected to hear today. Most had never heard it at all. Some looked at Francis with new eyes. Others looked down, as if ashamed they hadn't looked sooner. Cordell turned now, slowly, toward the stage, toward Shane. "You mocked a man," he said, the words flat but clear, "who gave you the right to make noise." Shane looked as though someone had cut the mic, even though he still held it. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came. The expression on his face had changed entirely. Not embarrassment, not fear, something deeper. Recognition, not of the man in front of him, but of what had just happened to the entire room. Cordell took a step forward. His coat shifted as he reached once more inside, and from his inner pocket, he withdrew something small, round, gleaming faintly in the morning sun. A coin, not a trinket, not a souvenir, a challenge coin, the kind passed only from hand to hand, from one who served to one who never asked for praise. It bore the insignia of Cordell's old command. Etched along the edge were 4 words, "Fidelity beyond recognition." Cordell turned back toward the stone. His hand lowered. He placed the coin on the marble beside Francis's folded flag. There was no speech, no trumpet swell, just that coin, resting, quiet, complete. Francis did not reach for it. He didn't need to. It wasn't given to be possessed. It was given to be witnessed. Behind Cordell, the mayor stepped forward, the microphone now forgotten. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't check the program. He simply walked to where Cordell stood and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. Then he turned to the crowd. "From this day forward," the mayor said, voice catching slightly, "the ceremony ends at that stone, not on the stage, not on a stream, right here." The crowd didn't cheer, not at first. What rose instead was a slow, uncoached applause, soft at first, then layered, real. It was not for performance. It was not for patriotism printed on shirts and banners. It was for something older, something returned. And then finally, Shane stepped forward. No camera, no laughter, just shame. He looked at Francis. Not the uniform, not the flag, but the man. His voice, when it came, was thin. "I'm sorry, sir. I was wrong." Francis didn't respond with a lecture, or a nod, or a forgiveness speech. He just looked at him, held his eyes, and blinked. Once, slowly. For some men, that's more than enough. Shane lowered his head and stepped back. The coin on the stone did not glint dramatically. It didn't need to. It simply sat there, small and deliberate, weightless to the hand, heavy as a mountain to the heart. There was something unshakable about the way it rested next to the folds of Francis's carefully held flag. It felt permanent, like it had always been meant to be there, as if the marble itself had waited for this precise offering for decades. Cordell stepped back one pace, enough to give the stone its own space again. His head remained slightly bowed, but his bearing hadn't changed. His spine still held the posture of a man who'd stood at too many ceremonies where names were read but not remembered. There was a finality to his stance, not of conclusion, but of completion. He had done what needed to be done. The rest, now, belonged to the town. Mayor Harlan, a man not known for silence, stood off to the side of the memorial with his hat now clutched in both hands. The brim was damp from his grip, his knuckles white. He looked toward Francis, then toward Cordell, and finally out at the crowd. No longer restless, no longer impatient. The families, the children, the elders, and the teens were all still, as though collectively holding breath. The mayor took one half-step toward the microphone that still sat idle on the stage, then stopped. He didn't return to the podium. Instead, he turned fully to face the stone and raised his voice, not with authority, but with care. "There are moments," he said, "where we don't need a program to tell us what to do. This is one of them." He looked back at the city staff behind him, motioned for no music, no announcements. Then he took 3 steps down from the stage and approached the stone himself. A tremor in his knee betrayed a recent surgery, but he didn't flinch. He stopped beside Francis and simply rested a hand, palm down, flat on the marble. "We've had it wrong," he said softly. "This isn't the backdrop. This is the heart of it." A murmur rippled across the crowd. Not disagreement, not chatter, but breath. The sound people make when they realize they've been part of something bigger than they understood. People began moving forward, carefully, not crowding, but approaching, one by one, not to take photos, not to get closer to Cordell or Francis, but to see the stone differently, to see him differently. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8, knelt and placed a small red ribbon on the edge of the stone. She didn't say anything. Her mother stood behind her, hand over heart, tears streaking unashamedly down her cheeks. The mayor turned to the Parks Committee chair, who had been nervously ringing a clipboard in his hands near the sound booth. Without waiting for a microphone or approval, the mayor nodded and said firmly, "We're moving it. Next year there's no stage. This is where we end, right here. This is the closing ceremony now." One of the city's maintenance workers, a man in a faded baseball cap and work boots, pulled off his gloves and stepped forward. "I'll build the platform," he said quietly. "We'll make it permanent. For him." Then, something unexpected. The local school principal approached the memorial, crouched beside it, and reached into his own pocket. He pulled out a laminated card, worn at the corners, a reading list from his late father, a Vietnam veteran who never spoke of the war. He slid the card gently beside the challenge coin. He never talked, the principal whispered, but if he were here today, he'd have stood with him too. The mood had shifted entirely. The ceremony wasn't following a timeline anymore. It had become something living, an unfolding tribute written not by officials, but by the awakened conscience of a town. No music played, no speeches resumed. It was as if the stage had dissolved behind them, the entire event now recentered on the quiet man who had never asked for anything but space to honor his dead. Shane stood several feet away from the crowd now, his live feed long forgotten. He had lowered his camera. He hadn't touched it since the moment Cordell placed the coin. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between remorse and realization. No one was paying attention to him anymore. And strangely, he didn't seem to want them to. A man from the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post, wearing a jacket heavy with patches, stepped beside him. He didn't scold. He didn't lecture. He simply handed Shane a small American flag, the kind children wave during parades. Shane accepted it with both hands. Then, as if unsure what else to do, he nodded silently and placed it near the stone. Cordell said nothing. His silence had done enough. Francis, still kneeling, slowly pressed his hand against the plaque again. Not to draw attention, not to pose, but to steady himself. And then, with the careful grace of a man who had once marched through jungles and deserts alike, he rose. Not all at once, not easily, but entirely under his own power. The crowd watched as he stood, back straight, flag tucked under one arm, glasses still smudged from earlier. He didn't look to the mayor. He didn't acknowledge the applause that began slowly and grew, not loud, but rich. He looked only at the names etched into stone, and then turned, finally, to Cordell. No words passed between them, but none were needed. They had done what needed doing, and now, so had the town. 1 year later, the grass was still thick and healthy across the town's main park, but the landscape had changed. There was no stage this time, no gaudy banner stretched across metal poles, no vendor table set up with noise-making hats and blinking pins. The crowd still gathered, just as many, maybe more, but their energy was quieter, centered. The stone was no longer hidden by picnic benches or backdrops. It now stood at the heart of the grounds, surrounded by a low, black railing, fashioned to resemble folded flags. A brass plaque sat just below the original memorial, newly installed. It read simply, "In honor of Francis Brenner and all who saluted quietly." Francis didn't sit alone this year. He had a bench now, a hand-carved cedar bench with the grain still fresh and sharp from the craftsman's tools. His name was etched along the backrest, not in bold letters, but in the same script used on military orders. Clear, timeless, formal. Children had gathered near it, holding miniature flags, some resting them on their laps like folded treasures. There were no instructions to do this. They had simply seen it done last year. Cordell sat beside him, wearing a pressed but unadorned civilian jacket, his old dress blues retired. His posture, though less stiff now, still carried the strength of his former life. In his hand was the same coin, not the one laid on the stone a year ago, but its twin. He turned it slowly in his fingers, absent-mindedly, like a rosary, like a memory he was keeping warm. Near the edge of the green, Shane walked slowly past the rows of flags he had helped stake into the soil that morning. He wasn't part of the ceremony. He didn't want to be, but his hands had been the first ones on the ground at sunrise, laying the flags into place, checking their angles, brushing dirt off each base before standing them tall. No one had asked him to come. He had simply shown up. Some people noticed. No one spoke, but in silence, there was understanding. When the final notes of the anthem played from a single brass trumpet now instead of a speaker, no one had to be reminded to stand. The park rose not in unison, but in instinct. Hands covered hearts, caps came off, and the stone, still and eternal in its place, seemed to command the moment without a word. Francis didn't salute this year. not with his hand. He simply nodded once at the stone, his breath slow and even. His eyes reflected the sky. He held the same folded flag across his lap, gently cradled, the corner just brushing the new brass plaque. A young girl, the same who had placed a ribbon the year before, came forward again. This time, she carried a drawing, a child's sketch of a man in a cap beside a flag, surrounded by stars. She placed it gently on the edge of the bench. Francis leaned forward, just enough to meet her eyes. "Thank you," he said. His voice was soft, almost graveled with time, but unmistakably clear. It was the first time anyone could remember hearing him speak in public. The girl smiled, then turned back toward her mother, who now held her hand over her mouth, not to silence her, but to steady emotion that had come too fast to stop. Cordell looked toward the horizon, the sun now cresting over the town's rooftops. He let out a breath, slow and deep, the kind of breath that says, "This is right. Let it stay this way." A quiet ripple passed through the people standing. Not a signal, not a command, just a movement, hands reaching out to the shoulders near them. Small nods exchanged, eyes closed not in prayer, but in gratitude. No phones in the air, no cameras rolling. Just people remembering the kind of man who never asked to be remembered. And below the brass plate, nestled discreetly into the bottom edge of the bench, a second inscription had been added since the last ceremony. Only a few noticed it that morning, but those who did stood still a little longer when they read it. It said, "Respect is quiet, but never invisible." If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you are watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.